Welcome to today's session, Counterterrorism, the Right Response. Global terrorism captures the world's attention and gives the few the ability to terrify the many. It isn't difficult to understand, therefore, why governments of targeted populations sometimes spend eye-watering amounts to try and counter that. But terrorism is cheap and it requires very little manpower. Counterterrorism measures are expensive and can have negative consequences. The world also, of course, faces many other challenges. The number of lives lost to terrorism is dwarfed by those lost to disease or indeed road traffic accidents. So why do they keep spending and why so much? Well, I'm very pleased to say we are joined today to explore these issues by Professor John Weller, who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. He's also a senior research scientist with the Mershon Center for International Security Studies at Ohio State University. He is a leading expert on terrorism and the reaction it inspires. We're also joined today by Professor Sir David Omand, a visiting professor at King's College London, and the first appointee to the revamped post of UK Security and Intelligence Coordinator, responsible for the UK's national counter-terrorism strategy. We will hear from them both and listen to their thoughts, and then I will open up to the floor and we'll have your questions and hopefully a lively discussion. Over to you, Professor Weller.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here at the legendary Chatham House. My time is quite brief, and let me just make three sort of quick observations, and then we'll have plenty of time to question and discuss, and you can express outrage and so forth if you want. It seems to me increasingly 9/11 is looking a lot like Lee Harvey Oswald's assassination of John Kennedy. In 1963, a basically trivial man managed to get extremely lucky from his standpoint and managed to kill the President of the United States. On 9/11, a fundamentally trivial group, Al-Qaeda, also got fundamentally lucky and created what is by far the greatest and most destructive terrorist act in history. That doesn't mean, obviously, Lee Harvey Oswald ceased to exist shortly thereafter. Al-Qaeda does continue to exist, but its record both before and after is something less than monumental. And it's certainly something substantially different from what has frequently been called an existential threat to the United States, the West, international civilization, or whatever. Before that, there was very few incidents which it had handled. And since then, if you look at what has gone on, it's not clear that Al-Qaeda Central has done much of anything, except maybe act as an inspiration, maybe do some training here and there and contribute to the Taliban's much larger effort in Afghanistan. It's also the case that, by and large, the terrorists that have been picked up or deterred or manipulated in various ways by policing agencies throughout the world have not been a terribly impressive bunch. I'm actually working on something now called the myth of the mastermind. And even looking at Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the so-called master, he's got two books on him, both of which have mastermind in the title, it's a questionable title. I mean, most of the time, he had zillions of plots, virtually none of which were ever reached fruition, and most of which were fairly daffy. Even in the case of his big success, from his standpoint, of course, 9/11, it's not even entirely clear that he knew what he was doing, because after the attack, he was going to try to do another 9/11, another hijacking, which means he didn't understand why 9/11 worked. Before 9/11, the standard thing was that if you hijack an airplane, the people on the airplane basically cooperate, the crew cooperates. In fact, just 6 months earlier, Chechens had hijacked a Russian airliner and it was diverted to Saudi Arabia and so forth. With the fourth, even on 9/11, that is to say with the fourth plane, it was pretty clear that whole syndrome was missing. So the idea that you could now hijack additional airliners is very questionable. And also other things like Ramzi Youssef, the so-called mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing. Basically, the bombing couldn't have done much more damage than it actually did, no matter what, even if it was bigger. And in his total life as a terrorist, he managed to be involved in the killing of about 34 people, 28 of which were killed in Iran by a bomb he made for an anti-Shiite group in Pakistan. Not a very impressive record, fortunately, for everybody else. So it seems the one place to look at that is the capacity of the enemy. It is there. It can do some damage. But since 9/11, as far as I can see, tallying it up, the number of people killed outside of war zones by Islamist terrorists of pretty much any breed has been something like 200 to 400 per year. That would include the London bombing, Madrid, Bali, and so forth. And that's 200 to 400 too many, but it's not exactly a monumental threat. Okay, the second point has to deal with the issue of what we should do about it, the counterterrorism thing. David Oman, in his book, talks about we should keep the risk to a minimum, and that's a primary duty of government. I certainly agree with that, but the issue would be, what is the risk now? What constantly gets said, and particularly in the United States, is, are we safer? And it seems to me that's profoundly the wrong question. If we have one additional security guard someplace, then I suppose we're safer in some microscopic sense. If we remove that security guard, we're equally microscopically less safe than we were before. So that it's a bad way to really start the discussion, but it's the way the discussion is mostly there and put forward, particularly in the United States. It seems to me the correct question is, how safe are we? And that's where you should begin. That doesn't end the discussion, but it certainly begins it. And it's fairly easy to calculate that, since we know how many people have been killed by terrorists over the last couple of decades. If you're an American, your chance of being killed by a terrorist is about 1 in 3.5 million per year. That includes in the calculation 9/11, all kinds of terrorism, including the Timothy McVeigh bombing in 1995 at Oklahoma City. If you're British, in Great Britain, your chance is about 1 in 5 million per year. If it's the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, the chance of being killed is about 1 in a million. Canada is about 1 in 3.5 million. Australia, 1 in 7 million. Anyway, that's the way things should basically start, it seems to me. So the question is not simply minimizing the risk, but asking yourself to begin with, isn't that safe enough? If your chance of being killed is 1 in 3.5 million per year, or 1 in 5 million or whatever, should you really spend a lot of money trying to make that even lower? And also, is it possible it could be a little bit more risky and save a lot of money and spend it in other places? To put that in context, just giving you the American figures, your chance of being killed in the United States in an automobile accident is not 1 in 3.5 million, but 1 in 22,000. Your chance of being killed 1 in 8,000. Your chance of being killed in homicide is 1 in 22,000. Your chance of dying from cancer is about 1 in 500. Your chance of drowning in a bathtub is about 1 in a million. So the 1 in 3.5 million, although terrorism, of course, is different from those other hazards in a lot of different ways, is a good basic way to start. I've written a book, came out 2 years ago. It's called Terror, Security, and Money, with my co-author, Mark Stewart, who is a risk analyst and an engineer at the University of Newcastle in Australia. And so what we try to do is apply standard risk management techniques and risk assessment techniques to terrorism. The same kind you'd have, for example, if you said, I think it would be good if we required that seatbelts be put in the back seat of a car. Well, then the question is, how much would it cost to do that? How much good would it do? Would it save lives? The back seat is safer than the front seat normally, et cetera. So that's the kind of calculation you want to do. You want to look at what are the consequences of a bad thing happening? What is the likelihood of a bad thing happening? How much will the security measure reduce either the likelihood or the consequences of the bad thing? And then compare that to the cost of the security measure. If the cost is lower than if the benefit of the measure is greater than its cost, then it's worth doing. We've applied that to a number of situations, and just to give you a few examples, the question is, if you've got a standard office building someplace in the United States, what would the probability of an attack have to be to justify fairly limited expenses to make it safer? And the answer is that the probability of an attack on that building would have to be 1,000 times higher than it is at present. And similar things, the federal air marshals proved to be wildly inefficient in terms of what they're supposedly trying to do, whereas hardening cockpit doors on planes does prove to be cost effective. So that's the kind of analysis that should be done, and it seems to me it's simply never done. In that, we were backed up by a report from the National Academy of Sciences, which said we went through a whole bunch. They spent the better part of 2 years studying risk analysis as was put forward in the Department of Homeland Security, and concluded that they don't know what they're doing. They couldn't find any studies that justified any decision Department of Homeland Security had ever made. I think that conclusion is a little bit too harsh, but nonetheless, the basic idea is fine. Is basically sound, it seems to me. Okay, finally, the question about keeping this to a minimum is a primary duty of government. The key issue is responsibility here, it seems to me. As Thomas Hobbes would certainly point out, your chance, the primary function, the foundational function of government is public safety. For virtually the first words in the American Constitution are preserve domestic tranquility. So it's the key reason people have governments. They want to be safe, walking down the street, their children going to school, etc. And they're willing to pay a lot of money in taxes and inconvenience sometimes to keep that sound. So therefore, dealing with it is a very important measure, and it should be done responsibly, because if you are spending a lot of money protecting people when their chances of being killed are very low, you're not spending that money on hazards that cause far more damage and can be reduced at far lower cost. So it's fundamentally a matter of responsibility, and it's fundamentally a matter of morality in many respects. You're dealing with human life, and if you're official in charge of this, what you have to do is try to maximize public safety, given that you only have limited budgets, at the best possible cost, and that simply has not been done. Let me conclude here. What am I doing? No, that should be fine. With one final comment related to that. David Ormond also says, let us not unconsciously add security fears to that list of reasons for not getting on with life. Another statement I totally agree with. But I'd like to deal with the statement about unconsciously, that we should not unconsciously, meaning officials, add security fears to that list of reasons for not getting on with life. What has happened since 9/11, certainly in the United States, and I don't think Britain is completely immune from this, is that there's been a tendency for officials basically to exaggerate the threat, inflate the threat. For example, and without giving full descriptions. And risk communication is very difficult stuff, but it should be at least attempted. For example, very early on, the Department of Homeland Security said in one of its promulgations, a terrorist could strike at any time, any place, anywhere, and with virtually any weapon, a case which may be somewhat questionable, but nonetheless okay. Now, if the next sentence said, however, your chance of being killed is 1 in 3.5 million per year, it would at least be in context, but the second number is never there. Early on, the intelligence forces were sure there were between 2,000 and 5,000 al-Qaeda operatives at loose in the United States. The correct number was extremely close to 0. You have people like Attorney General Ashcroft deliberately, not unconsciously, scaring people in 2004 with the director of the FBI standing next to him saying that al-Qaeda was going to strike later in that year. 90% of the preparations were through, and it'd be even bigger than 9/11. Nothing like that happened, and what it was based on was basically a lot of stuff coming out of Spain, apparently, which was actually somewhat known at the time. Most importantly, in this respect, are a couple of statements that came out after, a little bit later, 2007. George Tenet, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, now just at that time he had just recently retired, said on 60 Minutes that, which he was interviewing, is a top news show in the United States, news magazine show on CBS television, that he felt that his operational instincts were telling him that al-Qaeda had infiltrated a second wave of people into the United States even before 9/11. And he had no evidence for that, but it was an operational instinct. Well, the conclusion is almost certainly not true. There's a lot of evidence to why it probably wasn't true. But the very fact, he's willing to scare people based on his own admission on nothing, I think is really terribly irresponsible. At that same year, Michael Chertoff, who was the head of the Department of Homeland Security, the other official primarily responsible for American safety, said that his gut was telling him there would be an attack that summer in the United States. Something, of course, never happened. Once again, you have an official based by his own admission on nothing, his gut, scaring the American people. And that strikes me as being extremely responsible. So what seems to be important in these discussions is that officials analyze it in an appropriate manner in the cost-benefit analysis and risk management techniques that have been known for 200 years. Is mostly started out here by a friend of Isaac Newton, a mathematician he very strongly admired, and also to communicate risk in a responsible manner. As far as I can see, there's only been one case in the United States in which a public official has said, get a life, your chance of being killed is about the same as being by a terrorist, is about the same as being killed by lightning, once. And that was Mayor Bloomberg in New York around 2007. But that's the only time. Now, the problems would be, of course, that if you say your chance of being killed is 1 in 3.5 million per year, there's a danger someone might say to you, then how come we're giving you so much money? Perfectly understandable. And there's also a danger that if you say that if you seem to be downplaying the dangers and then something bad happens, you look very foolish and might lose your job. But it seems to me that's not a terribly good defense. It seems to me that people who are worried about that shouldn't take the job in the first place. It's someone like a fireman getting into business and saying, hey, I didn't know there were fires out there, or a soldier saying, my God, I'm being shot at. I didn't sign up for that. Essentially, it's a matter of public responsibility to deal with public safety in a responsible manner, and to not participate and not give a view that explain fully what the situation is to the people you are responsible for is again basically an irresponsible act. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on, very briefly, on John's thesis. What I'd like to do is just offer some comments under 4 headings. Question of resources, how much is being spent, and how is it all organized? Questions of threat perception, questions about the response and the strategy, and then the very interesting points John was making about risk management and personal risk. The main thought I offer you is that the analysis is very different on the 2 different sides of the Atlantic. I've seen an estimate that the United Kingdom spends about £3 billion a year on counterterrorism. I've seen an estimate the United States spends $1 trillion per head of population. The statistics show that Western Europeans, since 9/11, have been some 19 times more likely to die from terrorism than Americans. By my calculation, the United States is spending per head of population about 65 times more than we are. Now, you might, I think reasonably, and I think I would, draw the conclusion the United States is overspending. You might also draw the conclusion maybe we're actually not spending enough. When it comes to organization, I would be the first to admit that, because I used to co-chair the US-UK contact group on Homeland Security with Admiral Jim Lloyd when they were setting up the department, and he was the Deputy Secretary. And we already had a Homeland Security Department called the Home Office. It had existed since the 18th century. We had had to deal with the Irish terrorist threat. In Washington, it was all new. There was no central American department dealing with this subject. The Ministry of the Interior did kind of Indian affairs. So they were starting from scratch, almost certainly creating an organization that's too big and too cumbersome. And they had my sympathy because it's much easier in the UK. When I was putting the counterterrorism strategy together, we could get everybody in a room smaller than this and work out how to do it. So size is a real disadvantage. And we tried to keep it simple. So we didn't, for example, take aviation security out of the aviation department and put it in with customs and put it in with immigration and borders and create a giant. So no doubt the Washington at some point will have to look again at how all that is organized. Turning to the threat over here has been very different from that in the United States. There are no doubt fairly deep cultural reasons to do with assimilation, the famous melting pot in the United States, to do with the nature of the diaspora, or diasporas plural, that we have in this country, and the links they have back, for example, to Pakistan. But the truth is that there have, and still are, several thousand people in this country who are fundamentally hostile and violently hostile. And these are the people that the Security Service have talked about, and they are trying to prevent from carrying out attacks. And since 7/7, there have been about a dozen plots, attempts to attack this country. If the authorities hadn't uncovered and frustrated, for example, the airlines plot, then several airliners filled with Americans would have gone down into the Atlantic. Probably, if the terrorists had succeeded, and I'm not saying they would, because I share John's view that they're not as competent as sometimes portrayed, but if they had, that would have created casualties greater than on 9/11. The argument we would be having would be a different one if that had happened. So you can't really, I think, argue that the UK level of concern has been disproportionate relative to the very real threat that we face. And of course, we still have a residual Irish threat to worry about as well. So I wouldn't accept that threat perceptions over here have been exaggerated, and that out there aren't people who do mean us harm. Has the response been proportionate? Well, I think there are huge differences across the Atlantic here. The US security strategy under the Bush administration after 9/11, the first sentence of that strategy was, "America is at war." And the US strategic aim has, and I imagine still is, to destroy Al-Qaeda. The chosen means, we know, was the war on terror, not now a term much used, but it has its extension in the form of, for example, drone attacks, signature strikes, and so on. And the legal construct within which the United States has pursued this campaign is fundamentally different from the legal construct within which the United Kingdom has done it. For the US, it's a war. So international humanitarian law is what applies, and the terrorists have forfeited their immunity, their non-combatant immunity, by their actions, and can be attacked whenever and wherever they are found. The United Kingdom's view is that outside the battlefield, it's international human rights law that applies, and lethal force can only be used in self-defense against those who are posing an immediate threat. So the constructs have been very different, although the cooperation has been very close, and we've worked very, very closely with our American friends. Actually, fundamentally, the basis is different. When we started work on the UK counterterrorism strategy back in 2002, we chose and put to the cabinet, and they endorsed, a strategic aim. And it wasn't destroy Al-Qaeda, it was normality. And the threat of the strategic aim of the contest strategy was to reduce the threat from international terrorism so that people could go about their normal business freely and with confidence. Freely meaning the rule of law still applies, with confidence, tourists still come, we use the underground, markets are stable. We have those conditions today, so the terrorists have failed and we have prevailed, because we have set our sights as normality, not destroying all terrorism. They are, however, still fighting back. The Iraq War undoubtedly gave AQ a boost, as the Joint Intelligence Committee predicted it would. The long campaign in Afghanistan, what has been seen on the web, has continued to provide this radicalizing spur. So I would maintain that the current level of investment in security, policing, and intelligence in the UK is certainly not disproportionate, probably about right. In terms of risk management, the counterterrorism strategy we put together is a risk-based strategy. It's not seeking absolute security. It's saying we want enough security so that normality can prevail. The level of casualties from terrorism has been kept down by very good security effort and a certain amount of incompetence on the part of the terrorists, but there have been some very close near misses. It's illogical to infer from low casualty figures that the effort is unnecessary and we're wasting the resources. From this very platform in this room on several occasions, and some of you may have heard me say it, I have said, if you travel, anyone in this audience, travel on the London Underground, your chance of being blown up by a crazed terrorist is less than the chance of your being struck by lightning. That's an accepted fact. It's not what justifies the effort to maintain normality. It's not just individual risk, it's societal risk. And you just need to think, after 7/7 and the tragic bombings on London transport, a couple of weeks later, there was another attempt to do the same thing, which failed. If it had been successful, and then suppose we'd had a couple of assassinations or whatever, you bet the corporate lawyers of the big American banks and finance houses would have been advising their clients, we're not sure London is a safe place. Very quickly, the impact of being unable to contain terrorism would have been felt on the stock market, on the markets, on confidence in London as a safe global financial center. It would have had impacts on inter-community tensions. We saw that very quickly after Woolwich. Attacks on mosques, for example, vigilantism. So I would urge us not to underestimate the power of the jihadist narrative to radicalize, whether it's people are directly linked to AQ, whether they have a sophisticated understanding of actually the ideology or not, doesn't really matter. Final word on risk management. One of the great advantages of constructing the strategy, counterterrorism strategy, the way we have in the UK, is it is risk-based. And it's based on the risk equation. The risk we face is the product of the likelihood of something happening, your vulnerability to it, or society's vulnerability to it, the impact it will have if they get through the defenses, and then the duration of disruption for the public whilst the mess is cleared up and things are put back to normal. By working on all those factors in the strategy, we have been able to maintain normality and keep the level of risk down. A lot of the investment we've made, though, reducing vulnerability, improving the emergency response, improving resilience, is multi-purpose. And it's exactly that investment that you see in action when there's a pile-up on the motorway, when there's flooding, in future when there are cyber attacks. So investing in a more resilient society is not just about countering terrorism. So to conclude, I think the positions are very different on the two sides of the Atlantic. And I wouldn't deny that part of John's thesis at all, but I would be a little cautious about some of the inferences from it.
So we'll have questions in just one moment. I just wonder if you'd like to respond to anything you heard there before we open it out to the floor. The threat is exaggerated much more so in the United States than it is here.
I basically agree that, in fact, we've used the British example to try to urge the American politicians to think more seriously about it. The increase of spending in the United States since 9/11 has been about on domestic security, not including anything overseas, either in intelligence or policing or the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan. The increase of spending has been about $1 trillion. The increase of spending since 9/11 in Britain has been somewhere between 25 and 50%. It has been about half as much on a per capita per GDP basis. The increase in both Canada and Australia has been about one quarter as much. And so we use those figures frequently, saying, well, if Britain certainly has a terrorist problem, I mean, not the IRA as well as the current things, the politicians are still in office, and they seem to have controlled it with proportionally about half as much additional expenditure. That could probably hold the same for within the United States. I might add just one other issue, though, is the question about hatred. I've done a case book in the United States. It's on the web, called Terrorism Since 9/11, The American Cases. And we've done basically a case. There's been 53 cases which have come to light, come to trial, or are in the process of coming to trial in the United States since 9/11. And there's a case study following a similar outline for each of those cases. Some are not quite written up yet because they're so recent, but anyway, it's in process. And every year I update it. The effect there is very similar. It's basically a hatred that comes out. Overwhelmingly, however, the hatred is of American foreign policy. I asked the people writing the case studies, mostly honor students at Ohio State, what motivated these guys. And I was not surprised qualitatively, but I was really surprised somewhat quantitatively that the main thing that radicalized them, if you want to use that word, is outrage at American foreign policy, support for Israel, part of the thing, but also obviously the two big wars, support for Saudi Arabia and so forth, was almost entirely the motivation. They hardly mentioned caliphates. They hardly ever mentioned Sharia law. In fact, most of these guys wouldn't be able to spell either word. And so even though the Muslim community is probably in better shape and better integrated in the United States than in Britain, at least that's commonly argued, there are still plenty of people who are very much motivated and willing to engage in these actions. In many of the cases, however, the impact has been from the policing agencies. I don't know if this can be done in Britain, but for example, there was a recent case in Baltimore where a guy decided he wanted to do jihad, so he advertised on Facebook for fellow people to help him with jihad. He got 3 responses. The first response was from somebody telling him to stuff it. The second response was somebody trying to argue him out of it. And the third was from an FBI informant who said, yeah, I want to do that self. I got this car bomb in my basement, and I really want to set it off. Maybe we can meet and make beautiful music together. And so of the 53 cases, more than half are of that sort, in which a police or FBI informant actually joins the plot, helps bring it along, doesn't originate it, helps bring it along, and then the person starts to press the button and is arrested. So in many of the cases, it seems to be there may be a provocateur kind of element to them. But in no cases there's been legalistic entrapment, in the sense that in all cases the informants have come into a plot that was already at least into the embryonic stages.
I've got lots more I'd like to ask, but we'll open it out to the floor because these sessions whiz on by. If I can just ask anyone who does have a question to raise their hand and wait for the microphone. I'm told that's essential for the live stream purposes. If you could stand, give your name and your affiliation, that would be lovely. The lady here, I saw first with the scarf. Microphone's on the way to you. And then the lady there, and then we'll have the man in the front.
Josie Aldred, member of Chatham House. Until a few years ago, we looked a lot at the risk to aircraft. Since then, there's been the Algerian gas, and there's been a lot of talk about just 1 or 2 people doing making attempts. We're planning to have a very high-speed railway here, which will go through a lot of dark countryside at night. We'll therefore have to rely, I presume, very much on infiltration of Al-Qaeda groups, or sufficient to know that perhaps even just 1 or 2 people are going to go and put a bomb on the track. This will have it's going to have an iconic character, this train. So that would be spectacular, to use IRA language. What do our 2 speakers feel about just how much of a risk would that be
HS2.
exposed to? Yes.
The new high-speed rail that we are planning here in the UK. It's quite controversial and is by no means there yet. What would your response be to that? Is that a heightened, increased terrorism risk?
Yeah, we've been hearing this kind of thing since 9/11, forever. There just are an incredible number of potential targets, an infinite number, including this room. If you want to kill a bunch of people, you can do it. And so consequently, the fact that there's been so little of it certainly owes something to policing and protection and so forth. And in some cases, the policing or protection may be nearly perfect, namely for airliners. There's so many layers of security that it's not clear that any terrorist in their right mind would even think of it. And of the 53 cases I dealt with, nobody even thought about airliners. Probably they wouldn't have, even if there hadn't been that additional, but nonetheless, they went to other, they didn't do it. So there may be deterrence of certain targets. You can harden certain targets, but any good jihadist, any good terrorist say, well, I can't blow up an airliner, but I can do a zillion other things, including high-speed rail. You don't have to have high-speed rail. You can derail a low-speed train and kill lots of people, and the fact with very simple methods, and without even a bomb, I suppose, just with a hammer and a crowbar. So the fact that there are all these targets out there, the fact that very little has happened, basically, in the developed world, outside of war zones, throughout the whole world, including ones that are not very well protected, sort of suggests that the threat is really quite limited, and one should really get on with life in that.
David Owen, what do you think? There's this issue of shifting a risk, isn't it? You protect one thing, introduce metal detectors in airports, and then hostage-taking increases.
Sort of 2 points. One is that this particular group of terrorists do appear to have been fascinated with aeroplanes. And they've had a sort of iconic status, both over the Atlantic, over the United States, in Southeast Asia. Aircraft have been a target. Don't ask me to explain the psychology of that, but it's a fact. They have been obsessed with that. And we've been going through a sort of cat and mouse game. So the single, probably most cost-effective measure done for security of aircraft was lockable reinforced cabin doors. And that happened after 9/11, and I remember it was very difficult to negotiate internationally so that everybody did it, which they did. And so the pilot is supposed to have the door locked, and you can't just break it down. And that more or less removed hijacking. The screening at airports was introduced, very inconvenient for passengers. Answer, exploding underpants, exploding shoes. More screening is introduced, more restrictions. Answer from the Yemen, let's disguise a bomb as a printer cartridge and put it on a freight airliner, which they did. So there's a cat and mouse game sort of going on with some displacement effect. But when it comes to, and John is entirely right, the almost infinite number of potential spectacular targets, I would need some persuading that that was a reason for not doing something for which there was a good economic reason. I'm not saying HS2 has a good economic rationale, that's an entirely different matter. But if it had, or any other big infrastructure project, I would want a lot of persuading. I mean, we've got the Channel Tunnel. It's had a bad fire, if you remember, quite a catastrophic fire. But we didn't say, no, because of terrorism, we're going to close the Channel Tunnel. So normality, you have to go along with that. The Spanish did, of course, have a serious attempt to derail one of their high-speed trains, which very nearly came off. This was shortly after the attack in Atocha. And our German friends have also had some experience with attempts to attack trains. So far here, it hasn't really featured. But I don't think it's a reason not to do it if the case is there. But you would need to do some thinking about vulnerability and so on.
The lady there, if we can keep the questions nice and short, that would be lovely. We'll be able to fit more in. Are you still wanting one in front? Yeah, if we get the next microphone down to this gentleman. Over to you.
My name is Sohair Soliman. I'm an editor for Foreign Affairs from the Middle East. I can't help sensing that there is a double standard here. On the highlight what happened in Egypt yesterday, and the reaction of the West to take over from the previous government, the Muslim Brother government. The West have come with a theory that it is a coup. But in fact, we discovered that the terrorists, the Muslim Brother were actually terrorists, and all activities are a terrorist activity, and they came through just proving yesterday. And as well, by hitting Syria tomorrow or the day after, that will breed more terrorists in the Middle East, because we have seen the same scenario in Iraq, and that didn't do anything to the terrorists.
Okay, what's your specific question?
It's a double standard.
Double standard that makes things more dangerous.
To react to the political situation we taking, or the political steps we taking in our countries. Then,
are counterterrorism measures or actions, foreign policy, increasing the likelihood of terrorist attack?
Well, the counterterrorism measure that increased in likelihood was the invasion of Iraq and probably of Afghanistan, in the sense that it created this big sense that Islam is under attack generally. And many of the terrorists, both in the United States and in this country, give that as their primary motivation, their outrage about they're not necessarily all that religious, but defending their people or their co-religionists in many respects. So it's been that way. But outside of war zones, and this is somewhat definitional, terrorism really doesn't work very much. One of the big problems for the Muslim Brotherhood in the old days was some terrorism in Egypt, which revolted the Egyptians. In fact, in general, when people have tried to do terrorism in various places, it's had been counterproductive. Al-Qaeda attacks, for example, there's an explosion in a series of hotels in Jordan. And the result of that was that before these explosions, this is about 2003 or 4, before those explosions, about 50% of Jordanians had a favorable opinion of Osama bin Laden, and after that it was about 0.5%. As people don't like to be blown up, and terrorists trying to get their way by doing it sporadically are not, the reaction is overwhelmingly negative in almost all cases. Same thing happened in Indonesia, same thing happened in Saudi Arabia. So the efforts have been counterproductive often.
David Owen, what do you think? Foreign policy?
Yeah, I think you also have to ask the question, when there is a terrorist incident, who is the audience? And the audience may not be the public. So not all terrorist attacks are really driven by the intimidation of the public to achieve some direct aim, in the way in which, say, in a counterinsurgency, some attack is designed to get them closer to power. It may well be to reassure their supporters they're still around. And some of the pressure on jihadists, violent jihadists in the UK, has been to demonstrate that they're still in business. It may be to recruit supporters. And it may be that the Luxor attack, for example, was designed to show the strength. Actually, it was a huge miscalculation on their part, and this really drove the Muslim Brotherhood out of terrorism back into a political process. But the statecraft involved is not easy. I mentioned the drone, the attacks by missile from drones, which have undoubtedly removed some very serious terrorists, including people who are directly attempting to attack us. On the other hand, if you push that too far, then you begin to create some more hatred and a great sense of uncertainty in the areas concerned, that they're constantly under surveillance and so on. And in the end, that may be counterproductive. In the same sort of way as in Northern Ireland, in the early days, in the 1970s, the security measures that were adopted were probably, in the end, counterproductive, particularly internment. And when we tried coercive interrogation, it was a disaster. So it's a fine balance as to how far to do things that you can see have a direct effect in reducing the likelihood of an attack, and when to back off and say we've done enough.
And just briefly before we move on, in terms of foreign policy, and we heard the language there, double standards, you look at the West's response to the removal of Mohammed Morsi, things like that, the amount of aid or lack of aid that is given by the US to countries who aren't sympathetic with its foreign policy. We spend all this time and money on counter-terrorism measures. Would it be more effective, perhaps, to spend more money on projecting a more positive image of the US abroad?
Well, might spend more effort in not being there. You know, Costa Rica doesn't have a bad reputation in the Middle East. My favorite number from this is from Pakistan, a country with which the United States is not at war, I think, and which actually gives Pakistan tons of money, particularly for the military. And for the last several years, when you ask Pakistan, what is Pakistan's greatest enemy, the answer comes back, the United States. So this is really good news, I guess, for the Indians, but is really perhaps one of the most impressive foreign policy achievements of the last 10 years, turning a friend to now, you know, somebody you're giving tons of money to every year, now popularly seeing you as the greatest enemy.
You can have a debate about foreign policy and whether it exhibits double standards and so on. What I would say is I wouldn't want my country's foreign policy to be dictated by people who are letting off bombs. You know, that foreign policy should be by the government of the day, answerable to Parliament, not by a very small number. I mean, a few hundred dedicated terrorists is a few hundred too many, but relative to the population, it's a tiny number, and it shouldn't be dictating.
Microphone to the gentleman here, please, and then we'll go gentleman over there in the red tie. Keep them nice and short, because lots of hands now and not much time.
Thank you. It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. My question is about big data, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. The amount of data is skyrocketing day by day. And look, the United States, they have to hire outside staff like Snowden. And how do you evaluate this issue and deal with it?
Well, it's about like the NSA data collection issue. I mean, they've been collecting all this kind of.
So I think you need more money than now because the data is increasing day by day, and you need more staff and more machine and more money.
So more investment in.
In order to track all this, you mean? Yeah, well, lots of luck. They've been tracking it like crazy, and the results have been very pathetic. The metadata that I'm just doing an article on this, the metadata that the NSA has collected in the United States, every once in a while they find something through their algorithms which suggests something. These tips are then sent to the FBI. The FBI spends their own resources running them down and finding they lead nowhere. In fact, they're called Pizza Hut leads because eventually you trace down these numbers and one goes to the local Pizza Hut. The director of the FBI, in fact, has called it a useless time suck. Insofar as finding the terrorists within the United States, these are cases that come to court, and also some that have not quite come to court but are pretty obvious where things were developed. The internet is not really very important. I mean, they sometimes use it to communicate. It has been more helpful for the authorities, like picking up this guy from Baltimore who is shopping around for jihadists. It is not. They've gotten a bit of information from here and there, but mostly it's face-to-face communication. People coming together, spouting off, often under the influence of marijuana, and then deciding they want to do something, and then getting somebody brought in to lead them along, help them along.
Again, the position looks a bit different over here.
We've got the microphone there, and then we'll go to the gentleman at the second row from the back, just over there.
Thank you. My name's Hugo Rosemont. I'm a member of Chatham House. And my question is, to what extent has the private sector's involvement in counterterrorism since 9/11, and by that I include infrastructure operators and also suppliers and contractors, etc., to what extent has the involvement impacted upon the level of spending that has been allocated in this area in both the US and the UK? Thanks.
Yeah, it's part of what I call the terrorism industry. There's a lot of people selling things to the government. If the government says, I now want to x-ray everybody from here to Kingdom Come, and you're selling x-ray machines, you're likely to be in Washington very soon, and you're going to explain how great your product is, of course. but you're very unlikely to say you don't really need these. So there's a big sort of impetus coming from the private sector. I don't blame them particularly for doing so. They're just trying to sell their product. The people I would blame are the people who are buying these things. In some cases, like Michael Chertoff now has become basically a salesman for some technology. He's now no longer Department of Homeland Security, but he knows where all the right people are within the agency. So it's quite an important phenomenon overall. There are now magazines about what TSA or what the DHS wants, and what kind of products they're looking for, and the private sector people are working on it night and day, and sometimes making huge amounts of money on it.
I observe semi-humorously that it's only a problem if you've got too much money. So I don't think that particular aspect is a problem for us. But what is a problem is the fact that the critical infrastructure on which we depend, and this is much a cyber problem and a natural hazards and flooding type problem, the private sector runs the infrastructure on which normal life rests. And those are boardroom decisions taken not on the grounds of public safety and security, but taken on the grounds of whatever metrics the company is using. So it's very important, I think, the regulators set out clear standards. If you want to run a water company in the UK, you have to meet certain standards. If you want to run a power company, you should meet certain resilience standards. And then everyone's on the level playing field. And that will make society stronger. I wouldn't just chalk that up to counterterrorism. It's about just being able to rely on normal life, being able to continue, even when horrid things happen.
Gentleman there, yep, and then we'll go to the lady just there with her hand up.
Tony Baptiste, member of Chatham House. It seems that it's absolutely right to try and get a sense of proportion, and maybe now is the time to do it, but it does seem that 9/11 had one particular aspect to it which was different from most of the sort of conventional terrorist attacks, and that's that the terrorists discovered a new weapon, which was a flying fuel bomb. The fact that they had 200 people sitting on top of each one was sort of immaterial in a sense. And can you argue that the money we are spending may be more than is required to contest normal terrorism, but there is an insurance policy element which is about preventing the terrorists discovering another nasty weapon, particularly around the nuclear, biological, radiological area, and that we should be spending that money to be on our guard against that, because if that happened, it would be qualitatively different sort of attack.
Yes, let me sort of deal with two issues there. One is after 9/11, it's hardly surprising that people were panicked and throwing lots of money at this problem. And that's, it'd be surprising if they weren't. But everybody, the basis of common sense would be that when you do that, you're likely to spend the money in a bad way. Sometimes you may spend it really by luck in the right way, but obviously there's going to be a lot of waste. And after 9/11 proves not to be a harbinger, but an aberration, you'd think after a period of time they would start thinking about, reevaluating the expenditures overall. And with remarkably few exceptions, that hasn't happened, even after nothing has happened of remotely that magnitude, even after bin Laden has been murdered, even after the rhetoric coming out of Washington has actually gone down. So I keep waiting for that. And also the budget, the fact there's a big budget crunch, and you'd think that's one place, maybe we should investigate that. Maybe we're spending too much money on that. But it basically hasn't happened. In terms of the flying bombs, that was basically destroyed almost immediately on the fourth plane. The cheapest security measure in airlines, by far, because it costs nothing, is crew and passenger resistance. And you simply can't do that anymore. You won't be able to hijack an airliner. If there's hardened cockpit doors, that makes it even more so. In terms of the nuclear weapons, I did a book about 4 years ago, called Atomic Obsession. And there's 4 chapters in that book, published by Oxford University Press, in which I tried to look really hard at the issue, if you were a terrorist, how would you make a nuclear weapon, or get a nuclear weapon, or fabricate a nuclear weapon, or be given a nuclear weapon? And the difficulties for the terrorists are monumental. So I regard it almost vanishingly unlikely that they could do so. On the other hand, keeping them from being able to do so is fairly cheap. I mean, the issue about security measures is if you're already pretty secure, And you can become even more secure by just spending a little additional money. It might be worth it. You spend a lot of money, it doesn't make much sense. In the case of nuclear issues, one big thing you can do is basically make sure fissile material is accounted for. You know where it is throughout the whole world. That has a lot of advantages in a lot of different ways, and it's just a matter of bookkeeping. The other is disrupting any plot in terms of a market in fissile materials. And it's very easy to do that. Basically, all you do is have constant stings. People going around in various areas trying to sell bogus nuclear material, and people going around the same areas trying to buy nuclear. The whole market can get disrupted because you can't really trust it. And that's very cheap. So a security measure that, even though I think the likelihood is extremely small, the measures to make it even smaller are really quite reasonable to do and quite inexpensive.
Quick comment. I mean, in this room on previous occasions, I've talked about the combination you need of mini-max and maxi-min investment strategies. I mean, there are a few spikes of risk. Nuclear power stations would be one example, where you really just can't afford anything to go wrong. And whether it's a terrorist or whether it's just bad weather, combination of things, you overinvest in the security of those installations if you're sensible. And that's what I call minimizing the maximum damage the adversary, whether it's natural forces or a terrorist, the adversary can do to you. Trouble is, you can't afford to do that for many things, at least not if you're the UK. So you have the alternative strategy, which is maxi-min, which is maximizing the minimum level of assurance you can give the traveling public. But then you've got to be honest with the traveling public to say, it's not a very high level. We'll do our best, and we'll try and catch the terrorists, and we'll try and produce some basic protection, and there will be some armed police officers at airports and police stations, but there's no guarantee that the terrorists will not get through under the radar screen, because we can't afford to build a defense that would guarantee to keep them out. So you need a bit of both, and it's rather like the precautionary principle. There are some things where you just spend the money, pour the concrete, have the armed guards, because you just cannot afford to have anything go wrong, and public confidence would be hugely damaged if there was that kind of incident. But for the rest of it, you just get up in the morning, you get on with your normal life, you have to live with a certain amount of risk in normal life.
One footnote, your chance of being killed in an airliner by a terrorist is at present rates about 1 in 80 million per flight. And the question is that safe enough, or do you want it to be 1 in 100 million, or 1 in 2 billion, and so forth?
Just one final question from the, do you have a microphone already? We almost out of time, so nice and short if you can, please.
Yeah, hello, my name is Louisa Malchirek, a member of Chatham House. I'd like to touch quickly on a debate very current in the financial sector and how that influences our talking about the national security debate. Recently there have been improved regulations or sharpened regulations in the US and now in the UK as well. HSBC had to restrict their anti-money laundering policies, and the same with Barclays now, who are pulling out of Somalia, for example, as one country affected, pulling out their money transmission services. And this has now increased debate that exactly these regulations, which are supposed to prevent money laundering activities, which then feed into terrorist networks, would actually increase now terrorist activity on the ground, because people really can't use the normal channels of money transmission anymore. And that would then again fall in the hands of Al-Shabaab or other terrorist organizations, specifically in African countries. And do you think, in a way, that these policies, which are supposed to protect us and protect the services, can now in the end backfire and increase terrorist activity on the ground?
Yes, I haven't studied that particular aspect, but that, the way you frame it is exactly right, it seems to me. You want to look not only at the benefits, but also in the counter effects. And frequently that can happen. So that's, you definitely want to include that.
A lot of senior officials' time is spent trying to persuade ministers of the law of unintended consequences. But sometimes you just have to do things, and then when you get a further response, you have to be prepared to adjust it in the light of the way things work out. The financial restrictions on terrorism, and exercises such as the monitoring of SWIFT have produced some good leads which have been followed up by normal policing. Transaction costs, yes, they will go up because of that. At some point you may decide you can afford to back off some of these measures. And it's a point I think John was also hinting at, that so often with counter-terrorist measures it's a one-way ratchet. It takes a lot of political courage to take them down when they're no longer needed. You tend to get driven to do it with media pressure. And so some of this is why I think counter-terrorist legislation should always be sunsetted. And you need a positive decision by Parliament to continue it after, say, 5 years, just to give people a chance to think again about whether it's all really necessary. At the moment, I think it is.
We are out of time. I'm just going to ask for a final thought from yourself.
Well, just following up on that, basically, the issue that comes for that if you think the only thing that matters is are we safer, then the measures you're saying would make us less safe. And the key issue is, do they make us less safe to the point where we can spend the money on something more important? That's the kind of decision that should be roundly worked out.
Just leaves me to say I know you have to get off straight away. Thank you very much indeed to both our panellists, Professor Sir David Omand and Professor John Mellor. Certainly feel slightly safer from your lovely statistics. I will carry with me and repeat later today, I'm sure. And thanks very much indeed to everyone for coming and for your questions. Thank you.